esteemed colleague and teacher, Mr. Michael Burawoy, about his positions on various issues, most particularly epistemology, sociology as science, politics and sociology, sorts of thing. And we will begin the questions with Arvind.
Yeah. First of all, could you tell us what brought you to sociology and what you see your task as being as a sociologist?
I'll take one of those, the first one. I suppose I began my interest in sociology actually when I came to the United States. Between leaving high school and going to university, it was 1965, as I recall, which was a very beginning of a very turbulent period in this country. I was 6 months here. I think that broadened my interest into social issues. Until that time, I had only been interested in two things. One was football, and the other was astronomy. Anyway, I then went to university, actually. After I came back from here, I went to the university in England, and I studied actually mathematics. I had gone to a school which trained me nothing but mathematics, so I did mathematics university, and I hated every moment of it. But I decided to continue with it, and it was only after during that time I did do some other traveling, but I think it was after I left university as an undergraduate, I went to Africa, that I really became committed to being a sociologist. And actually it was in South Africa that my interest was particularly peaked. I was a journalist there for 6 months, and then I went to Zambia and decided actually to try and study sociology in Zambia. And in the end, I actually worked in the copper industry for 2 years there as a sort of pseudo-industrial sociologist, because I was mainly because I was short of money. And the subsequent 2 years, I actually did an MA in social anthropology. So that's very briefly how I came to sociology.
Can I ask what brought you to the United States in '65?
There was unfortunately nothing very significant. I just
Just wanted to travel?
well, yeah, and particularly the United States. I mean, there are two views in England about the United States. One is that it's a place you don't have nothing to do with. It's crass and big and evil, and and for others, it's an exciting place, and that certainly was my image, and it certainly was reinforced. I spent a lot of time in New York, and it certainly widened my horizons as to what was important in the world. And it was at the beginning of the sit-ins and teach-ins, so I say not sit-ins, the teach-ins, and it was obviously at the beginning of FSM too.
Why was it that you decided to come to the United States to do your graduate work as opposed to doing it in Britain?
Well, I did have this social anthropology degree from Zambia, and it's in Zambia that I really developed my interest and commitment probably to Marxism. And I spent a lot of my time reading development theory, American development theory, in Zambia, political science mainly, but also anthropology. And I thought this was pretty bad stuff. And I thought that I should go to where it is actually being produced, and in order to engage in an effective critique, I thought the best thing would be to actually gain credentials at a place where it was being taught and where the prime figures were. And that place was in fact, well, one of the prime places was in fact Chicago, which is where I went. I crept in through the back door pretty well. I was low down all this. I managed to get in there. And when I got there, of course, I discovered that nobody was interested in development issues. No one interested in new nations. The Committee on New Nations, which had been a very important institution in the development of development theory, had been pretty well dismembered. And so I was there stranded. Nobody was interested in Africa anymore. So I had to rethink what I was going to do.
What was it particularly that you saw here that was that heightened or your political or your social consciousness different from your experience or whatever?
Well, in the first time when I come from Manchester. I was a sort of relatively sheltered life in Manchester and middle-class life. And when I went to the United States from New York, and it was at a time when things were really happening here. There were lots of social movements emerging. Civil rights was very important when I arrived, and there was the beginnings of the struggle against the Vietnam War, and also the Berkeley episode was beginning to be on people's minds. There was a turbulence in the universities, and at that time, particularly, I thought that the university was a very important arena of political activity, and I think that was very much reinforced when I came here.
You went to Berkeley?
No, are you talking? I was saying I was here to the United States when I first came in '65. I mean, when I came in when it was '72 when I arrived. When I came back again, I mean, the atmosphere was transformed, and I'd missed a lot of the major activity in the middle. So, in '72 there was in Chicago, which had been a center of student political activity. Then 69, 70, 71, so 72 had been eclipsed, and there were not actually many signs of it having been there when I arrived. I was quite surprised, actually.
So you decided to go to the university because you saw that as an important way of having a role in the political arena?
Well, I mean, that's not really that wouldn't be an accurate statement. I mean, I always wanted to teach. I mean, there's no, in the university. I mean, there was, and I just couldn't get excited about teaching mathematics, and I suppose even in Cambridge, I was looking for a totalistic perspective whereby one can teach and live one's life in the same sort of framework. One tried to, and sociology always, and this is before I became Marxist, sociology always seemed to be the most attractive field in this respect. It really seemed to encompass so many different aspects of life, and I was concerned with the linkage between one's own personal life and the world out there. So, but I always wanted to teach in university. I mean, and it's not as if I thought that was necessarily the place most appropriate for political action or anything like that. I thought I wanted to teach.
So research comes second for you then?
Well, I feel you can't really teach very effectively unless someone's doing research, and I think they complement one another, and I would always try to do both, and I feel pretty bad when I don't, when one of them's missing, actually.
Right?
Well, I was going to ask a question that, going back to when you went to Africa and you sort of encountered, I guess you were reading some of the American sociology about development. Well, I guess my question was, when that happened, what was it especially about? Was there like one central issue in their version of development theory that really somehow caught your attention and made you think it was really wrong?
Yeah. I think there were two issues, actually. One issue was the view that development theory tended to have as if that suggested that somehow, in this case Africa, but third world countries were different, and that, they have problems because of their strong linkages to tradition, to primordial ties, the importance of the family, importance of culture. This was what was emphasized in development theory as impeding development, particularly economic development. And it was always assumed somehow that the third world was different, that these were tribal people and we in the West were modern people. And that's the center of sort of modernization theory. And even the most sophisticated variants, it's there. And seemed to me that led to an analysis, a particular type of analysis of third world countries that missed very important things, not least of which, and this is the second point, the fact that class was as important in third world countries as in European countries and advanced capitalist countries, and that this seemed to me to be the sort of a class analysis seemed to offer a more balanced, actually, from my point of view, a more balanced picture of the development of underdevelopment. And not to castigate Africans as somehow different. There was an implicit, usually not explicit, an implicit racism in the perspective that I thought was an implicit racism behind much of development theory. Somehow Africans didn't have the resource, the educational culture to develop. And I think there were some much more fundamental obstacles. And I tended to look at the class character of developing societies, as opposed to others at the time, like Gunder Frank, who were talking about the neo-colonial or international context of third world countries. So I tended to look more at the class forces within societies and the way in which dominant groups in developing countries themselves perpetrated an ideology which saw the subordinate classes as backward in some sense, and that very often the ideology of neo-colonialism was used by dominant groups in third world countries to mask the fact that these too were class societies, and that this was the problem.
Are you referring to, Ben,
Go ahead.
are you referring to somebody saying that, are you saying that they were class societies before? Because it seems to me that there's not necessarily a contradiction between sort of an international perspective that says that, in essence, the spread of the international economic system, in effect, creates that class condition.
Wait 1 second. The camera's off. Not off.
No. No, well, no, Brian, yeah. Well, I see there is a big difference between those two perspectives. And they have different political implications. The internationalist perspective basically roots the problem of underdevelopment in the transfer of surplus from third world countries to core countries. And the problem then is an international domination. The alternative perspective, a class perspective, tends to stress the significance of the particular mechanisms through which surplus is appropriated from subordinate classes within third world countries. It's the class character of third world countries itself that is the obstacle to development. And so what that means is you have choices. Is the root problem of underdevelopment in the international character of relations between countries, or is the root problem in the class character of third world countries? Now, if you adopt the latter one, then you'll be interested in the transformation of the class character of third world countries. If you go for the first, the international perspective, then one wants to, it's not clear exactly what one wants to do. One wants to perhaps transform the character of the world system. But what it means is for the dominant groups in third world countries, they can blame outside forces for underdevelopment and, in a sense, excuse their own domination of subordinate classes. So one wants, in a third world country, this is a very tricky issue, whether you locate the enemy, in a sense, outside the country or the dominant class.
And if you do identify outside, that's the basis. Would you say that that's the basis for a nationalistic movement?
A nationalistic movement, very much so, and also one that tends to obscure class. Now, obviously, both factors are working together, but I think you have to begin to make some choices as to, when one's in a third world country, I think one has to make choices as to what type of analysis one's making. And it's not, I haven't seen any satisfactory bringing together of both an internationalist perspective and a class perspective.
John?
I was wondering, you said you were working as an industrial sociologist, so I tend to infer that means that you were mainly interested in urban areas. Did that focus influence, or how did that focus influence how you came to see the perspective in class terms instead of tribal?
Well, it was central. I was working actually in a large, very large multinational corporation copper industry in Zambia, which supplies 95% of the foreign exchange of Zambia, and has dominated the history of Zambia and, as it was, Northern Rhodesia before, and basically Northern Rhodesia was based just the copper industry, and everything that any development that took place in the colonial period was precisely for the infrastructure for the copper industry. And I was actually a sort of part of management. I was involved in what they call these days a job evaluation exercise, it's not very important, but I was involved in union management negotiations, and I had actually gone there because somebody at the university had said, we don't know anything about how these multinational corporations are reacting to independence. Independence had been, I was there in '68, I came in '68, and independence had come in '64. How are these big multinational corporations reacting to the new regime in Zambia? And so that was my question, and I found a very nice job to begin to examine that through partisan observation, and saw exactly what was going on, and well, exactly, more or less exactly what was going on, and it's from that experience actually that I did develop the class perspective, because it was so clear that class was so central. In fact, the first book I wrote was called The Colour of Class, and it was all about the way in which African advancement took place within the Zambian copper industry, the way in which blacks moved up, but whites managed to maintain the colour bar within industry. But basically, there was neither, even though there was some African advancement, there was not a transformation of the class character, of the copper industry or of Zambia. And I think you're right. My emphasis on the class perspective stems very much from my experience in the copper industry in Zambia.
Nina?
I wanted to go back to your critique of the modernization theory. You said that they looked at third world countries as primitive and that was their problem. And I'm wondering how you differentiate Marxism in those categories. It seems to me, I mean, you quoted Marx saying, country that is more developed industrially only shows the less developed age of its own future. And I'm wondering how Marxism can guide your work if it doesn't have a purely logical narrative to it.
Well, I mean, that quote is a quote that I've explicitly, many Marxists have explicitly repudiated. It was the work of Trotsky, was an attempt to show that that unilineal notion is really not a very useful one, and that in fact capitalism doesn't develop unilaterally, but develops in sort of leaps and bounds. It's combined and uneven development. And I mean, I see the difference between a Marxist perspective and development theory, or my own Marxist perspective, because there are very different Marxist perspectives on development theory, is that it looks at the class character of third world countries and sees the transformation, and sees the possible emergence of economic development through the transformation of class structure. And that itself has to be waged through forms of struggle. It is not a matter of transforming the attitudes and the culture of these societies, but actually transforming the class character of those societies.
And that will be done through control of the means of production in terms of work at the workplace or control of the technologies.
Right. I mean, you know, that's right, yes. And of course there have been experiments of this character. Though people argue whether they really are experiments or not. I mean, whether they really were transformations, but Tanzania is one case. And I think a much better case is Cuba. But there are, you know, generally they're few and far between. And Zambia was an extreme end of capitalism. I mean, you know, it was a very capitalistically oriented society.
Let me take the discussion to a slightly different area. How was it that you went from being interested in the third world and development issues to being interested in the American working class and ultimately doing your dissertation on one factory in the Chicago area?
Well, as I said, that part of my project, as I have seen it, is to show that in fact there are great similarities between third world countries and advanced capitalist countries. Structurally, there are lots of similarities. For example, I did quite a bit of work on migrant labor. People thought until 10 years ago, that migrant labor was a phenomenon that's really of the third world. You know, it's those people in South Africa, they move backwards and forwards because they really don't, and this was very often the case, don't have a commitment to work, and so they're always going backwards and forwards back to the village. They're really rooted in these primordial ties in the village. Well, so that was, for a long time, a dominant perspective on migrant labor in Africa. And I knew that there was migrant labor from California, from Mexico. You've got people going to Germany, from Yugoslavia, Turks too, I mean, all over Europe there was a very important phenomenon of migrant labor, and in the United States. So what I tried to show, and one of the things I wrote, was the structural similarities between systems of migrant labor in third world countries and systems of migrant labor in advanced capitalist countries. So, in a sense, it wasn't such a big shift for me. I tried, it was very, and I think it's very important to continually make explicit comparisons, because I think what has happened in development theory, there is, people know the realities, perhaps, of a third world country, and implicitly they compare it with a stereotype of what happens in advanced capitalist countries. But the explicit comparisons are not there. So I was always very concerned to actually do careful analysis between the two countries and see what actually then is distinctive to third world countries, rather than somehow making all these presumptions.
So your dissertation work was in a sense to do sort of a full-blown class analysis of a particular case in this country.
Right. Well, there's obviously the whole series of accidents, how one gets into these things, and how one's short of money, and therefore I went and got a job in a factory, which paid many of my professors were getting at that time, and I obviously had, I had been a sort of industrial sociologist in Zambia, but I didn't sort of just forget what I'd learnt there. I think I carried it with me to Harvey, Illinois, where I did my study. And, yeah.
Could you talk about the sort of central thesis of that book? I suppose it's captured in the title, Manufacturing Consent. What was it that you were out to look for, and what do you think the work proved?
One never really knows what one writes about until very late on. What I think I was trying to say were two things. One was, contrary to certain forms of Marxism, consent is actually consent emerges at the point of production rather than conflict. Now, conflict obviously exists within the context of the workplace, but I was trying to show, in fact, that actually consent was manufactured there too. And that in fact, all this talk about, and this is the second point, all this talk about the importance of the family and schools, yes, they may be important, but they are, even if families and schools were very disruptive and tended to generate anti-capitalist struggles, still the thing would hold together because consent is being reproduced at the point of production. That yes, schools, families do have an effect, but but very often the Marxists have argued that, well, basically the working class tends towards a resistance to domination in the workplace. But this is counteracted by ideological state apparatuses or institutions such as the family, the community, and it's these institutions that actually domesticate, fragment, isolate, neutralize working class struggles. And what I tried to say was, no, those working class struggles, yes, there are struggles, but they tend not to in any way threaten capitalism, and they, in fact, what happens at the point of production is a production of what I call consent. So that was the major point of the book. It was written as a critique of industrial sociology, but the ideas behind it were, in fact, sort of an argument with Marxism.
So the strategy which seems to clearly flow from that is that if one wants to sort of break the sort of consciousness that is reproduced in the workplace, one should go to the workplace and challenge the way in which that ideology is reproduced, as opposed to going to the university or going elsewhere, say.
That's the pessimistic conclusion that one draws. On the other hand, precisely because I was talking about the mechanisms that generate consent, it's particularly difficult to do it there also.
Your thesis that consent is manufactured at the point of production. I guess what I wanted to know is, what do you think is the causal lever behind that? Is it the material conditions of production that workers in fact are coerced, or they have material interest that they have to hold on to through that process? Or is it something about the relations of production in terms of just the social interactions that go on the shop floor, or somehow the ideas that they bring to the shop floor that are reinforced there? Or because, I mean, it's one thing to say that, that consent is manufactured there, but we also know of cases where it wasn't, and where there was actual struggles immediately, like, for example, Ned Blood, when they broke the machines immediately. So what do you, I mean, are there, in different situations, are there different causal mechanisms?
Right. Well, I mean, the argument of the book is an extreme one, and deliberately so. It's supposed to be a corrective and supposed to be, in a sense, polemical, and to some extent people have taken me up on it. And my more recent work is an attempt to sort of qualify the argument and to look at situations precisely where there has been struggle of a revolutionary character. And there are many periods in history, I mean more of historical now, there's many periods in history where this has obviously taken place. One, you can think obviously of the Russian Revolution, particularly between the February 1917 and October 1917. And one can think of the factory councils that emerged in Turin in 1919, 1920, and similar episodes in Germany. And one can think of the emergence of the working class in England in the middle of the 19th century. So what my present work is an attempt to begin to understand precisely why, in fact, these struggles do emerge at these particular times, and also why, of particular interest to me, is why they have occurred. They occurred in Poland in 1980-81. And that has led me to a somewhat different type of analysis, to begin to situate my little allied corporation in South Chicago and situate them in a broader context. And, well, I suppose I should hold off before talking about my other work. But yes, there are different, under different circumstances, there will be struggles. But I think what I would like to, what I still feel is that this, what I call this hegemonic regime, this particular form of industrial relations that emerged in the late 30s, in this country, consolidated during the war, and really sort of became very strong in the 50s and early 60s, that form of industrial relations, and what I call the factory regime, the way in which relations within the factory regulated, were very effective in coordinating the interests of workers and capitalists.
I'd like to know what exactly you mean by production. Do you mean strictly Marxist interpretation? And if so, where do you see the point of conflict coming from people who are still working class but no longer work in actual productive activities?
Yeah. Well, production, for me, has more than just a purely economic component, i.e. engaging in productive tasks. It involves an ideological component, the production of consciousness, and a political component, the reproduction of relations. And so production has an economic, political, and ideological moments. And I formulate it that way. I mean, a number of consequences of that, but one of the important things is to begin to try and understand how it is that people consent to what they're doing through processes within the workplace. And the other thing is to rebut the notion that there are economic laws given to capitalism, because once you build in the notion of politics in production, then you build in a notion, inherently a notion of struggle, that means that history is not necessarily made just behind people's backs according to iron laws, but in politics and ideology are implicated in production, and therefore, you can't build laws that sort of suggest there's going to be a movement in a particular direction in the future. Because that presupposes that production is only made up of sort of human beings considered as objects, purely as agents. They are, in fact, thinking agents engaged in political practices. So that's the issue of production. And what was the second part of your question?
The second part of the question was, given that definition of production, how do you see the relation? I guess in that sense, all kinds of working class jobs can be seen as productive.
Right.
But what are the relationships between working class people in factories,
Right.
working class people in
Right.
bureaucracy.
Right. Well, I have tended to deal with industrial workers in the narrow sense, and I think that state workers are something that one has to deal with in a somewhat different way within the same framework. What is important for state workers, in my view, is the fact that the political character of the workplace is actually bound into the state, and there's a sort of an emergent unity between state politics, or the sort of national, global politics, and workplace politics. And you see, for example, when you talk about state industrial workers, it's quite clear. I mean, for example, in England, the mine workers strike at the moment. It's heavily politicized. One of the reasons being is because it is a nationalized industry. It is, in a sense, part of the state. And equally, state government workers here in California, they too have engaged in particular types of struggles, the character of which I think is somewhat related to the way in which production is linked to the wider political scene. So I think that's different from the private sector.
What about, one more follow. What about service workers in the private sector?
Well, what sort of... Well, I'm not clear what service workers are.
How about a travel agent who works for a privately owned firm? Would she be considered part of the working class?
Well, obviously, I mean, she's part of the working class. It's a matter of whether, in some sense, she can be distinguished, whether such workers can be distinguished from industrial working class. And whether...
You do say in your book that, if I can quote, that the industrial working class represents the most fundamental point of critique both of advanced capitalism and of state socialism. And I was curious as to why you didn't include other non-industrial working people who, in a Marxist sense, also produce surplus labor.
Right. Well, let's not go into who produces value and who doesn't. What I meant, I was really justifying, when I said that, I was trying to justify looking at antiquated workers. I mean, in a sense, workers like machine operators, who people believe are becoming almost extinct. Well, it's not true. They are not coming extinct, but people think it's of a bygone era, and that we should be looking at flight attendants, or we should be looking at, or we should be looking at, well, if you wish, your travel agents.
They're going to be obsolete anyway soon.
Because of the computers, right. What I was trying to do in the book is really, I mean, what has happened is that I think amongst many Marxists, there's been a movement away from an interest in the working class towards some notion of new class or social movements. And the purpose of this last book is really to bring us back and say, look, there are still industrial workers, and they do still present us with a very important, and I still argue, the most fundamental critique of capitalism, understood in a very orthodox Marxist sense of the private appropriation of surplus. That is why I think they are a good point of departure still. And as to these travel agents, well, I think, I don't know what I mean by industry anymore. They're obviously a part of the working class. And the way I would try and deal with different fragments or fractions of the working class would be to look at what I call their production politics, and identify different forms of production politics for different fractions of the working class. And that would be the way I would look at these different fractions.
I'd like to come back to this notion of the politics of production, if I could, and point out what I think might be a contradictory position. Namely, when looking at work, you clearly take into consideration ideological and political components or determinants of the labor process. Yet, on the macro level, say in the determination of the working class, you ultimately adopt what you might call an orthodox Marxist perspective, which is that it is work, that it is the economic instance, which determines the working class more so than political or ideological factors, like schools or families. Do you feel that's a contradiction in your argument? In the one case, you seem to be taking all factors into account, and then in looking at something like the working class, you seem to prioritize the economic instance.
Well, I don't think I see it as a contradiction. It may be one. I'm really trying to stress that there are these arenas in society, the economic arena, and there is a large state arena, and perhaps we can include community arena and the family arena. And within each arena is responsible for producing certain things that contribute to the whole. But within each arena, there are these economic, political, and ideological moments. And what I'm trying to say is, yes, that's true. There's politics everywhere. There's micro-politics everywhere. The state, in a sense, is the politics of politics. So all arenas have a politics, all arenas have an ideology, all arenas produce something. But also, I would say that the arenas are not sort of all co-equal, that some are more important in shaping the direction of society than others. My claim is, whether it's acceptable or not, is that the production arena is the one that ultimately gives us most mileage and explained variance of important variables.
Can we cut it for a while? Can we cut a capitalist class as dominant? Or one is doing something else, perhaps transforming the relations of production for more collectivity or a more collective spirit. Is that fairly accurate to assess your position as saying that? I mean, there do seem to be these two alternatives that you have, right? One is either reproducing and one is transforming the relations of production. And I assume that one is an angle that's advantageous toward the capitalist class, and another one is advantageous toward the industrial proletariat and a more socialist ethic. Why are those the two ethics that you choose? Why are those the two strategies, two possible strategies? I mean, it seems to me that in some ways you're saying something different when you say the patterns we discover in history are not immutable, nor are they toward some ultimately true pattern.
I don't understand that quite. You can ask it, but I don't understand it.
No one understands that?
Try and condense it.
Maybe you could translate.
Okay, I mean, as I understand what you're saying, you want to, in some ways, distinguish yourself from traditional classical Marxism by saying that a telos of history, a direct purpose, direction, and goal of history, needs to be thrown out the window. That there are possibly many other teloses into history. Yet I think you accept the framework within Marxism that one is either reproducing the relations of production or transforming them. And I assess that in your estimation there are two different possibilities. One is either leading toward a collective spirit or one is leading toward what we have now, domination of the capitalists. Okay? Why are those the two possibilities that you choose? I mean, in fact, you say something that I find
Shocking.
shocking. Good word. Moreover, the worker is sucked into, on page 17, the
I
worker
hope this is all on tape.
Is it?
Yeah.
Good.
The worker is sucked into the oppressive isolation not only of her own material circumstances, but also in the name of enhanced autonomy, greater freedom to balance domestic work and low-paid wage labor. What's being rejected there is the idea that I assume these women have of their own conception of why they're working and what their jobs are. Their strategy, perhaps, is entirely different from fitting into the framework of reproducing relations of production for the capitalists or transforming society from the interest of the working class or socialists, which you seem to reject. There doesn't seem to be a place in your methodology or in your teleology for any other alternative other than either reproducing or transforming the relations of production. I would think that a lot of times women are interested in they're using their jobs to provide some greater freedom in a context that doesn't particularly relate to the two alternatives that you see.
I can answer all that.
Yeah.
Was that?
Yes. Okay. Go ahead.
That was all on tape?
Yeah.
Okay.
Very important.
Yes, well, I do take the position that a central question for Marxism is whether and under what conditions capitalism will survive. So I'm interested on the one hand in the reproduction of capitalism, and on the other hand the transcendence of capitalism. And those are the two questions which I take with me to my research. And And so I evaluate what I see in the light of those two issues, reproduction stroke transformation. Now, obviously, capitalism does change over time. The very mechanisms of reproduction generate change within capitalism, and as all my work is an effort to show. Now, it is true that people who I study, who I work with, do not see the world through these two questions. They don't see the question of the transformation of capitalism, reproduction of capitalism as central. Even in translated into their terms, it would not be central. They are, for the most part, concerned with day-to-day survival. And for many of them, it's a very difficult business. And they have to make ends meet. And it is precisely the fact that they have to make ends meet within the context of capitalism, that they have to play the sorts of, I call games. They're not really games in the frivolous sense, they're very serious things, but forms of response and resistance and reorganization of work in the workplace. They engage in these activities in order to make their life somewhat bearable within the context of capitalism. Capitalism itself is mystified as conditions that actually make work inherently depriving, make it inherently uncomfortable, make it inherently degrading. The conditions that make that necessary are somehow sort of pushed aside and obscured at the same time, because they are actually engaged in trying to make ends meet. And so the point of the book Manufacturing Consent was that, yes, it's very true that the working class, the people I work with, and myself too, we had to do certain things, we followed certain rules, played certain games, and in the process, the so-called the great relations of production, they disappeared. They were not important. They didn't make much sense. What made much sense to me, whether the rates for the job was lousy or not, whether the inspector would check my piece tomorrow or today, these were the critical issues of negotiation on a day-to-day life. But I see my role as a sociologist, social scientist, stroke Marxist, is to actually begin to situate people's day-to-day experiences within the context of capitalism and its implications for the reproduction stroke transformation of capitalism.
See, but I'm not sure that you really answered my question. I mean, I gather that your opinion is either one is reproducing the relations of production under capitalism, in which case what they're probably doing is they're ignoring these kind of broader questions of what their work, how their work is being used as chains of enslaving them within those relations of production. Or they're taking on this broader perspective, and the broader perspective is that they now see the workplace as a place to transform the relations of production from a more collectivist spirit. But it still doesn't seem to me, I mean, what I'm interested in getting at, in your estimation, are there basically these two alternatives, and that's what we have? Or do you want to more subscribe to what you're saying on page 10, or at least subscribe to it in the way that I interpret it? The patterns we discover in history are not immutable, nor are they directed toward some ultimate true pattern. It seems to me that if you want to say that there are these two patterns, you do tend to see that there's ultimately a true pattern to history, or at least to history as we see it now.
Oh, I don't think I'm saying there's two patterns. I'm saying I want to examine the conditions under which a collective radical movement might emerge. And that's some of the chapters in this book are about looking into what conditions precisely a radical working class movement emerges, whether it's in Poland recently or whether it's in Russia in 1917. I'm not saying it's inevitably going to appear. I'm not saying what happens after you have such a movement. I don't have any notion of a clear end, but I am asking the question, under what conditions will this collective consciousness emerge? Collective, I've been reading too much Durkheim. That's okay. Under what conditions will it emerge? Not saying necessarily what will eventuate after it has emerged.
So in that sense, it's open then. What's going to happen afterwards is determined by other factors. But you're looking at a factor that's prior to that, in fact.
Right. And we know from history what happens after 1917, or what happens after,
Yeah, that
in
in fact it's
1922.
not determined that, I mean, because there's a multiplicity of possibilities, not maybe a multiplicity, but there are different possibilities, that it's not determined, so you can't say.
Right.
I'd like to go to a far more basic question to move us into the larger issues that we've raised in the course. Do you think that Marxism is a better paradigm than other paradigms, and what are the grounds for choosing Marxism over other paradigms? Is it an objectively better way of understanding the world?
We're not asking you
Sure, you can answer this question if you want.
But I don't think Michael thinks that anyway, because in your article on the resurgence of capitalism, or the resurgence of Marxism, you say that the university is virtually the only refuge of Marxism, and therefore it's cut off from not only the working class, but also other social movements. So therefore, in this regard, I wonder if Marxism is so cut off, how useful can it be? It's supposed to be serving the working class. If you're interested in the transformation of the present system to the working class can not be alienated any longer. Why is it that Marxism is confined to universities? And surely you feel marginal if this is true.
Yeah, they're related questions. I don't know how I'm going to relate them.
Okay.
I'll start with. Yeah. I have difficulty saying that Marxism is a better paradigm. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's up to you. And it's up to you to say what you mean by better, and I will give you an answer. It's a paradigm that I feel more comfortable with than any other paradigm. I mean, there aren't clearly other paradigms. I mean, Marxism is a very powerful tradition, and there are many, many different forms of Marxism, and some people will claim there really are two very, very, very different forms of Marxism, and there's not just one Marxism. I don't see it in one paradigm, should we say, if we're going to juxtapose, and that's a very complicated thing to do, the sociological tradition to the Marxist tradition. I don't see one, in a sense, being better than the other. I find myself situated in one rather than the other, and I do see them as very different traditions, asking different questions. And I also see the Marxist paradigm borrowing a great deal, and I think that's what's interesting about the contemporary Marxist discourse in universities here and in England and Europe, is that they has borrowed many of the ideas from sociology, from Weber in particular, but still situating it within the Marxist tradition. And on the other hand, sociology has almost been a parasite on Marxism. I think sociology would not have existed if Marxism had not existed. It emerged as a response to Marxism. And I think one of the problems was with sociology, and why, in fact, there seems to be a sort of a shaking out and a diffusion of paradigm, of the sociological paradigm, particularly the strong, very powerful, very important structural functionalist paradigm that emerged in the 50s in this country. Its failing was its success. Its failing was that it actually managed to abolish Marxism, basically, together with other forces that were operating at the same time. But basically, it abolished its very raison d'etre. That Marxism really was pushed out of academia in the 50s and 60s. And, well, it wasn't very much in, but there was an interest in the 30s, at any rate, in Marxism. And many of the great sociologists of the 50s had been Marxists, albeit for a short time, had been Marxists in the 30s. And my view is that structural functionalism was so effective in totalizing the sociological discipline and orchestrating a paradigm that it undercut its very existence by pushing out Marxism, which had been its original motor. And so it's very enlightened of these sociologists now to allow these token Marxists to exist in some places. And you see that Marxism has come back and has, in a sense, been reshaping sociology. I mean, people do not ignore Marxism in quite the same way as they did 15 or 20 years ago. That is, but that becomes problematic for a Marxist, since it seems that, from my analysis, what one is doing is actually giving a bit of energy and resuscitation to sociology. But that's how I see the relationship between the two. And of course, the other, Michelle's question about how is it possible to be a Marxist in university? I mean, which was one is often confronted with. It's obviously a very difficult question to answer in any satisfactory way. I mean, in as much as there are no social movements in the world out there, it's just a holding game, isn't it? I mean, one's just waiting for the next cycle. Every 30 years there are social movements. But what is interesting, of course, that in the past, the university has pushed out Marxist radical thinkers in the more conservative period. So there is particularly in the United States, very little continuity between the radicalism of successive generations. And so I think the case could be made for sort of maintaining one's existence in the university, waiting for a period of emergent social movements, and when in fact university, I think, would be a centre of such social movement as it was in the 60s, and it was indeed in the 30s.
Then what? I mean, I guess I see the validity of your point, because I think that it's important that, in effect, the university is a socializing agent, as we talked about before, and that it does have influence on society. It's not, I don't agree that it's not part of the real world. And given that when periods of social upheaval do happen, it's often the younger generation that's involved with new ideas and is going to school, and especially in our country where there's more and more people going to higher education, that there is some, universities have tended to be a center of political activity. I guess the question is then, I don't know if we really want to get into it, but what is the relationship of the intellectual or the professor to the students and also to other political groups that are organizing outside of the campus that might in fact be organizing politically at the point of production, where our theoretical framework is supposed to tell us is really the powerful center of transformation. How can you foresee those types of connections?
Well, I think the connections, they can be forged. I mean, I think even in the present context, bleak as it is, and perhaps even because it is so bleak, people in universities are in a very good position to facilitate struggles that, for example, industrial workers are engaged in. I have been peripherally involved with the plant closure project. And what has struck me in the Oakland plant closure project, what has struck me is that these workers who, facing plant closures, really do not have the resources to know what strategies are at all viable in combating plant closures. And that's something that struck me that, people in university can do. They can begin to develop an understanding, A, of how multinational corporations operate, and B, how the legal system operates, and to discover loopholes in the legal system that can be struggled over. So that is a role that one can play from the university, even in these moments. And of course, one is engaged continuously in teaching, two types of teaching, graduates and undergraduates. And undergraduates do go out there and fill places in bureaucracies, and they do take sociology courses. What the consequences of those sociology courses are is not always clear, but it seems that at least a different vision of alternatives, a different perspective on capitalism is something that one can display in the context of teaching too.
Are there certain times in history, just a short follow-up, are there certain things that you can look back on where you see those in the university as having some type of relationship that could be modeled later on in terms of relationships to movement?
Specific historical episodes that sort of...
times you look back to where you see that there was that type of possibility? Or do you see that in the modern period it's more and more, it's more easily done than it was perhaps in the past, where universities might be more
Well, students have always been very active, have very often been very active in social movements, and including working class movements, and that's very true again in Russia, the end of the last century, beginning of the present century. There was a big struggle over civil rights, and to be sure, the students from the universities played a sort of auxiliary role, but they did play a role, and the free speech movement was a very important, it seems to me, and its reverberations around the country in different campuses did seem to have an impact upon how we look upon American society. What is of concern is that one develops a new vision of how to see American society, and then that vision just suddenly slips away. And until the next period when we rediscover it, it seems that we should be building on it from one period to the next. And that's somehow, that's my intuition about this country, that there are these breaks, these ideological breaks in consciousness, rather than a building. And that's my understanding also why working class consciousness takes a particular form it does in this country. And I have in my mind a very different context, for example, in Poland, where the struggle starting from 1944 until 1981, 1982 were cumulative. Every outburst, there was a new understanding, and new strategies, a new conception of what was possible, and they each stage built upon the next. And it's sort of just a reflection of that discontinuity in this country is the way in which radical people are shunted in and out of universities according to the sort of political environment.
Michael, would you call what you're doing science?
When? What I'm saying now, or generally?
Yeah, your work. Your new work. In what sense?
In what sense? In what sense? I'm trying to explain things in the world. I'm interested in causal types of analysis. And in that sense, I'm a scientist.
So science has to do with causal analysis.
But, well, I was given a choice of how to define it, and that's how I'll define it in this context.
Do you see other forms of the inquiry into knowledge, or the search for knowledge as being science also, or are there different forms of knowledge seeking that would fall outside of explanation?
Well, I think I would claim that at least all the sociology I see ultimately does involve causal analysis. There are people who claim that they don't do it, but I think they do. I mean, Bob Bella probably is probably would defend the strongest position against notions of science, but I think even his work involves some sort of causal analysis. He's interested in the perpetuation of certain American institutions. And so I think that, well, we talked about Winch. I mean, his claim that somehow you can get rid of causal analysis and still be sociologist, social scientist, well, let's leave the word scientist, but still be a sociologist, I find that difficult to believe. I don't see it actually exemplified anywhere. I think ultimately we are all interested in explanation and the causal character.
How would different theories... I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Arvind. Jocelyn's next.
How would different theories be counterposed against each other in respect to their attempt to provide different causal explanations of singular phenomena?
Well, if one accepts the notions of causality, then when there are different theories, theories are situated in different paradigms or research programs. And research programs have a distinctive set of questions, distinctive set of concepts, and different phases of a research program recreate in different ways the same questions and perhaps new concepts. So that one does have different research programs building upon one another to make traditions with the ultimate purpose, and that's what makes them in a sense scientific, of explaining the world in a particular way. So it's Justin, no?
Jocelyn.
So would you say that although different explanations maybe built upon each other or are trying to explain the same phenomena, that they all somehow point to an ultimate truth, or that they all exist independently and we'll never know which one is the right explanation?
Well, that comes back to Scott's question of which is the better paradigm in a sense. We're at one slice on that question. I do believe that there is an empirical world out there that does set limits on the explanations one can offer of what is happening. At the same time, that empirical world only sets limits, and within those limits, different paradigms, different theories can operate and be, in a sense, there's no clear way of distinguishing between them. And that's, again, it's not my belief, it's my belief, it is my belief, that the empirical world out there cannot falsify in any simple way Marxism, just as it cannot falsify Parsonsian theory. These frameworks, research traditions, research programs are not falsifiable by sets of facts. They can be adjusted always to fit new facts. And sometimes in the process of adjustment they appear very inelegant and cumbersome and ad hoc, and one may feel that somehow this is getting too much and one has to throw them out. But even then I still feel that the world out there is not going to help us make decisions about the world out there in terms of just this in terms of trying to explain the world out there. That endeavor is not going to help us differentiate between different research programs. That has to be done on a different basis.
Is that because people have different theories that they're actually seeing different things out there, or because that material can't bear proof on any of their theories?
Well, different programs, different theories will see the world in different ways. There will be an overlap. That overlap, however, will not be sufficient, will not provide a criterion for dismissing one or other theory, in my view. You can always, even the overlap, there's no final test of these theories. It is sure that the Marxists will look, for example, in my present work, I have begun now to look at these, what I call these factory regimes. That's something that's not been sort of carefully, I don't think, carefully researched before, carefully looked at. It's emerged theoretically, and therefore one goes and looks at these particular factory regimes and sees particular types of things. So, in a sense, the world out there is understood, is represented, and is created, not created, but is constituted out of the questions one asks and the concepts one uses. But once that is done, then one does see a particular world, does see factory regimes, and perhaps other theories will have to take them into account, but they can take them into account. And so it's not, to my mind, one works within a research program, one arbitrates between explanations within a research program, but not, one cannot sort of arbitrate, the world out there can arbitrate between research programs.
David?
You said that, just getting back a little bit to what you said about science being basically involved in the project of drawing out causal laws, causality from reality. And you also said something else that I thought was really interesting, and that is that more people than want to admit it are in fact engaging in causal analysis. What is it that, is all causal analysis science? Is all, in other words, all attempts to draw up a theory that would say this comes from that, loosely, or that comes from this, loosely, or directly. Is all that incorporated in your notion of science? Or is there a dividing line between these different types of causal explanations? And what is it? What is it that demarcates something that's a causal analysis from being science or not being science? Or is that distinction necessary?
Yes, well, obviously, we're all... if we reduce science to causal analysis alone, then we're all being scientists all the time. I mean, we're all engaged in causal analysis. You're anticipating what I'm going to say, and you're thinking, and what's causing me to say the stupid things I am doing.
We're making a causal analysis of my behavior.
So it's a necessary but obviously not a sufficient condition. So what else is involved in the notion of science? Well, I suppose if I were better, I would say it was disciplined causal analysis. But that doesn't really get at what would be its distinctive character. I don't want to talk about science globally. Let me just perhaps stick to sociological analysis. I mean, that's... And I think that what is distinctive about a sociological analysis, what distinguishes sociological analysis, and that is a very difficult thing for me to formulate and to be clear about, and I haven't made up my mind. What distinguishes sociology, in the sense that Marxism, what we practice as department some of the time, and the sort of the theories that everybody has in the world out there that we supposedly study and communicate with, and ourselves in our day-to-day life too, is, I think, first of all, that it is rooted in a self-conscious theoretical framework. It's rooted in a self-conscious set of questions that are formulated and with a corresponding concepts, and that's a disciplined character of it. I mean, it's a constraint imposed by a research program. There are certain things in a research program, like questions and concepts and definitions, that are that cannot be flouted. So it's a rule-bound. The rule-boundedness of our causal analysis is relatively clear and hopefully coherent. And the other thing that I would stress is the comparative aspect, is that what we do is that in our day-to-day life, very often we see things in a very fragmented way. And I see the purpose of sociology, Marxism as a science, and this concept, in this sense I'm linking the two, as situating day-to-day experience in two ways. One, in the context of the totality of society in which it exists, showing the forces that impinge upon people to generate a particular lived experience, and also in a comparative sense, showing how day-to-day experience may differ from different countries, and then again trying to explain why, in fact, in different contexts, different countries, different groups do have different experiences. So the idea is that the purpose of sociology or Marxism is to begin to situate people's day-to-day experiences in a much wider context, to understand why it in fact is not as natural as it appears, but actually has specific conditions which generate it. So in fact that it is not eternal and permanent as it appears, but something that can be changed.
Was it follow? So just to summarize a little bit, as I see it, you laid out two further stipulations. One is a self-conscious, rule-bounded nature of this causal analysis. I have a question about that, in as much as that seems to explain a lot of causal analysis, right? That they're self-conscious and they're rule-bounded. I don't see how it necessarily distinguishes whether or not something's based upon a reality that it's trying to speak to or not. But there was a second point to what you said, and that is, if I'm summarizing it correctly, its explanatory capacity, its ability to explain reality, or explain the framework from which it's operating, and explain a set of questions that exist independent of the particular origin of the theory. Or generally, you were pointing to something similar to what was in a lot of the readings: science as an explanatory, having its explanatory nature, its ability to explain reality in a convincing way. My question is if it's, in terms of its explanatory capacity, is it a question of, does it explain reality somehow objectively for everyone, or is it particular groups of people or particular sets of questions that it can explain? And can any particular science get away from the problem of not being able to explain for all? Is that clear
For all
enough?
the different groups.
Right, for all the different groups, because I feel in some ways there definitely is some explanatory capacity that your work clearly demonstrates. On the other hand, the question comes up to me is, what does it explain, and for whose interest does it explain something? And I would like for you to elaborate that particular question, because I think that that's connected to it.
Well, I mean, it comes back to your earlier questions, and I'm obviously interested in explaining the reproduction of capitalism, on the one hand, and the potential transformation of capitalism, and also actually state socialism.
Why is that what you're interested in? Actually, that's not. Forget that question.
No, take that question.
I mean, in a sense, is that a question of science or a question of ethics?
Obviously, it's a question of it's not a matter of ethics. It's certainly a non-scientific question. I take that as a point of departure. There's no problem about that. That's a political statement. I mean, that I evaluate capitalism in a particular way, quite negatively, and I'm interested in
So
following that through.
In your assessment, that's an ethical judgment, or that's not a scientific?
No,
judgment?
you're asking him, can he justify something?
Yeah. Okay. Can you justify?
Absolutely no way, I don't think.
Huh.
So therefore, you have this personal evaluation before you even come to sociology anyway.
Sure.
So therefore your
That's why I
sociology...
came to
That's why
sociology.
you came to sociology. And therefore your sociological work is just really to almost justify it to other people.
That's certainly one of the tasks of my sociological work. Most sociologists try and persuade other people that what they're doing is correct. I use scientific techniques also to do that. Some people are persuaded more by them than others. I mean, quote science. I mean, there are different techniques for different audiences, and you want to persuade different groups in different ways. But yes, no, that is. I begin from that premise, and I think within that set of questions, one then examines the world to get a better understanding of this question of how capitalism reproduces itself. That's where I was obsessed with, in this question of why is it people work as hard as they do? How is it that they reproduce capitalism? It's not obvious to me that they should. But that the question itself did not have its scientific origins. Oh, no way.
Nina?
I wanted to connect this to a question that I think David was asking earlier, although I'm not sure exactly the question, but anyway, it's my question. It seems like you're saying people either reproduce capitalism or they transform it towards socialism. Is that right?
No.
Well, what?
No, he didn't say that.
No.
Well, it can be transformed in like various ways, but there's
The period of post-capitalism is not a clear one, and it has many directions.
But many directions within a certain context. It's either a reproduction of relations, or it's a transformation that, at least if you don't want to call it socialism, toward a more collectivist spirit.
No, it may not be towards more collectivist spirit. There's nothing clearly given about what happens after capitalism. I mean, but Nina, do you want to follow up what you said?
Yeah, I'm wondering. I didn't understand in your article how you can tell when relations are being transformed and when they're being reproduced. And I was wondering if you could say more about that. And then you talked about the other people who study other social movements don't look at the underlying causes that are creating these movements. They just study the effect of the surface facts. And I'm wondering how you can tell what surface facts can be attributed to what underlying reality. This is connected to the first part of the question. I don't know if that's clear.
No, it's not clear, but let's deal with the second part. I mean, you're asking the question of how. Let me just see if I got it right. How do we know that capitalism is capitalism, and when do we know when it changes into something else?
Or
Reproduction. You want to know when is something being transformed as opposed to being reproduced.
right.
And when do you really know what's happening?
Well, I mean, it's a very difficult question, obviously. I mean, one comes to an assessment, one can talk about specific cases like, you know, the Russian Revolution, one could argue that in fact capitalism was under threat, and in fact gradually through 1917, 1918, the ownership of basic means of production, the factories, did become increasingly centralized in the state. And there were other changes that went along with it. The factory councils that were very powerful in the Soviets were over time squashed. And so one does get a transformation of the political arena too. And I think I don't have problems at this point in seeing changes. I think the problem comes when somebody else gives an alternative interpretation of a particular reality, a particular set of facts. And then who's asking the same questions, obviously. And then there has to be some negotiation, and we talk about it, and we look and examine it more together through some sort of dialogue. I mean, that's how such scientific research works. It's not, you know.
I'd like to step back when you were saying, I mean, you obviously have a political purpose in what you're doing, and you say you're doing science. Do you agree with Feyerabend that all scientific work is propagandistic? And if you do you intentionally propagandize in your work? And if so, do you think that's true of all sociologists?
Well, I always say on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I feel somehow that science is propagandistic. On Tuesdays, Thursdays, Saturdays, and Sundays, I think it's, you know, it's really something that one should be seriously committed to. And so most of the time I do. Now, that is to say, it's complicated because the science and the science are different ways of presenting one's work. And I do present my work in order to persuade. So when I write a critique of sociology, you know, if I've got a sociological audience, I'll shove a few regression equations in. That is for some people more persuasive than stories that I collect from the shop floor. Now, other people get more involved in stories from the shop floor and find that more persuasive. Actually, stories are usually, in general, more persuasive than regression equations. And also just the language one uses. Now, if one's writing, you know, a paper that is for a trade unionists, or then you don't write it the same way as you write it for the American Journal of Sociology.
But you would consider both papers scientific?
If, in fact, I was concerned, as I hopefully am, to explain something, like to explain why it is in this period plant closures don't face a lot of resistance. And so I can write that paper in many different ways for different audiences, but hopefully the analysis, the essence of the analysis will be similar. So there is a propagandistic element to it, but on the other hand, that doesn't mean one is very carefree about, you know, don't just say anything. One is trying to make a coherent argument.
Do you conscientiously think about the difference between your scientific argument and how you're going to present it to a certain group?
Oh yeah, no, I'm quite conscious about how I present my, well, particularly written stuff. I think perhaps less verbally, I'm not as good as that, but written stuff, yeah, I'm very conscious. I mean, I write for left journals and straight sociology journals, and they're different things. I mean, this book, the beginning last chapter, is for Marxists, clearly for Marxists. My other book, Manufacturing Consent, is for sociologists, and it's written very differently. You know, it's possible that sociologists may read, you know, non-Marxist sociologists may read, but I write for an audience. But I think most people do.
Arvin? Yeah, you said that historical patterns are themselves historically contingent. There are no eternal laws. What about human beings' relationship to their fellows in transforming nature and therefore achieving a certain sort of consciousness? Isn't that, in fact, Marxist philosophical anthropology, something that's transhistorical? Do you see that as a contradiction?
I certainly don't see it as a contradiction. What my position on Marxist anthropology is again, a very difficult one. It's very difficult not to have some view of human nature, ultimate human nature, and establish a critique of any particular society. But there are transhistorical concepts there are transhistorical assumptions in any research program. Of course there are. But that doesn't mean you can say that the future holds a particular end. I think they're very different. So I think embedded in a research program are some constants. But that is not to say that history is going to move in a particular direction.
Michelle?
Yes, so you said this book, your most recent book, is for Marxists only as such. So would it be fair to say that you're making a criticism of many of your fellow Marxists? Because at one point you make the point that many, I don't know whether it's scholars or many people anyway, and many intellectuals exchange ideas about, for example, the working class without actually engaging in any empirical work. And you're saying here you are with your extended case method, you've gone out to the field and you've grounded it in empirical reality. So do you think that that was meant specifically for so many Marxists who just exchange ideas without any regard to the real world outside?
Michelle, my view of Marxism is not quite the same as yours, Michelle. I don't think that, I would not make that claim about Marxism that they are in some sense more guilty than others of not going and studying the real world. But what I do agree is that this was aimed against and my fellow Marxists. The first chapter, you have the two chapters. The first chapter was designed as a critique of those who seemed to believe in the Marxist fold. The last chapter, so in a sense, a defense of Marxism. Let us look at the workers. There are many workers in the world now, and you know, they are still quite an important force, and particularly a revolutionary force in parts of the world, not in the United States. Then the last chapter was an attempt to critique orthodox Marxism, based on the idea that there are none of these iron laws, that history is continually being recreated in our understanding of it. So, on the one hand, it's an attack against those who left the fold, and on the other hand, it's an attack on those who sort of retain orthodoxies that I don't find sort of fit the present conjuncture, are not resonant with the times.
Jocelyn and David.
Perhaps the question is based on the fact that you launched your science from your values. First, does a person need to justify what values they have? Is there some sense of an ultimate good or bad? And then, why should I buy your explanation of how you see the world, of anything, if the value behind it is not discussed, is just taken for granted? How do I approach any explanation you give?
Well, I don't think it's not discussed. I don't think it's taken for granted. I mean, I think particularly, when one feels marooned, in the sense there are so few Marxists around, one is continually reflecting on the presuppositions one works with, and who the hell is one. And I think Marxists have always spent a lot of time talking about their ultimate value. It's Arvin's question about the anthropology of what is human nature and what actually is feasible in the world. That is something that they have discussed a great deal about. I suppose I do take some things for granted that I find I don't always question perhaps as much as I should, to do with the possibility of something called socialism. I've tried, that's most of my current work actually is an endeavour to think about that question, though, to think about what forms of socialism are really possible, what really are the alternatives to capitalism. I think that is an absolute central question for Marxism, which has not received the attention that it should. And I think that the first question you raised about how does one justify values is a very difficult question how to talk about, but I think that one can engage in begin to try and engage with people what ultimate values people do share, and then there are just events in the world out there that do sort of shift people's values. For example, in '56, the invasion of Hungary shifted many communists out of the Communist Party with a really sort of generational phenomenon, generational episode that many people left the Communist Party. And and what I'm saying is that episodes in the world out there do have an impact upon values and what is possible and what one's committed to. So the world out there is not irrelevant to the values one takes, but it does very often take a major event of that character to shift.
So when different perspectives have their dialogues and they're trying to compare the explanations, does it matter if they're just talking about the explanations, or do they in fact need to somehow start getting to the values that these explanations are expressing? Is that more crucial, or can we be satisfied with this intellectual dialogue and skipping the values?
Right. Well, it's a very tiring business, always going back to basics. And obviously, a lot of sociological discourse. The reality is you forget about the research program, the values, the concepts, and so on. And really, one reduces programs to hypotheses, and one tests the hypotheses. That is generally a much more easy way of engaging in discourse and doing things, rather than continually going back to sort of basic commitments that underlie one's framework, which is a very difficult discourse to engage in, and not one that I'm actually well versed in doing. But I feel very strongly that when I write something, I try to think of it as being situated within a research tradition, whereas some people just take research traditions, take out hypotheses about some event, and then test them against one another. That is not something that I'm particularly comfortable with doing, because I do believe, I feel myself part of a research program, whereas many people feel, the idea of value-neutral sociology is a research program unto itself, one in which one doesn't have to discourse with ultimate values because they're pushed aside. It's still a research program in my view, even if it's not self-consciously such.
David?
Off of that, and as a development of what we were discussing before about the distinction between ethics and science, for instance, you said that you have certain ethical presuppositions or assumptions which guide your work, and you were very clear. They're ethical decisions, they're not necessarily scientific decisions. What I wanted to know is, what does science have a relationship to those ethical decisions? In other words, can science question those ethics? And if so, what does one do with that? Okay.
Yes, well, let's take the case of Hungary, the invasion of Hungary in '56. How does one analyze that? Does one see this in terms of sort of an imperialist movement on the part of the Soviet Union, or does one see it in terms of maintaining a movement towards socialism within Eastern Europe? These questions, I think, can be examined historically and then scientifically. The outcome may have an impact upon the values that one is committed to, and it clearly was for so many communists. So I'm saying, yes, a scientific analysis does not necessarily have to, can affect, shift the basic values one has. And it may shift one from one research program to another. So it can, but it need not. And I think one is continually, in some sense, evaluating one's values against the real world. For example, I'm continually wondering, what are the possible forms of socialism? The only way I can evaluate that is to begin to look perhaps at existing socialism. What happened at the attempt to introduce socialism, whether it's in Hungary or in Cuba or in the Soviet Union. So one begins to try and evaluate that in causal terms of what really were the problems in the degeneration of the Russian Revolution. That's a causal analysis. And the answer to that may affect what one feels is actually possible, what possible forms of socialism there are. One would be wondering to what extent one will be wondering to what extent one can explain the Russian Revolution in terms of the specific historical circumstances under which it took, or whether one wants to explain it in terms of the inherent, inevitable degeneration of any attempt at the movement towards some notion of socialism as collective self-management. I mean, and one can evaluate history in those terms, and that affects, you know, how one will evaluate ultimately Marxism.
Okay, I think this is really important because a lot of socialist theory about self-management is very much based upon philosophical anthropology that says certain empirical, in fact, realities about human beings and their activities, their possibilities, their potentials, et cetera, in different historical periods, we see different exemplars of different types of people, for example, who have exhibited certain capacities, etc. And what I'm saying is that certain formulations of what an ideal might be, or what's possible in society, are based on, in sort of a retrospective way, on what are possibilities that have been emergent by human beings in history. And my question goes back to how do you ground ethics? It seems to me that there's an implicit grounding, scientific grounding, ethical grounding in science that says that given that human beings have displayed certain potentials at certain periods of time, or historically in certain periods through certain developments of society, that indeed you can evaluate the present and evaluate the past in comparison to some ideal formulation of what human nature, in a sense, not is, but has potential to be. How do you sort of see that? Do you see that as being somehow a progressive idea or a program?
Well, I don't think one ultimately can validate any notion of human nature by looking at the world, because one can always make the claim that somehow the real world degraded human nature. There's always a way.
Well, I'm talking about optimal things, not degraded. I mean, obviously that's what...
Yes, no, but it's very difficult to refute a particular optimal notion of human nature, what ultimately in an emancipated society human beings will be like. It's very difficult to refute any formulation of such an optimal notion of human nature, because there's a world out there can never deny. If you want to say, look, the potential of human beings is this many-sided richness that Marx talks about, there's no way you can easily refute that. And evidence may suggest that under certain circumstances people have been able to develop those talents when domination was less. Some arguments of that character may be made. But nevertheless, there's no way in which you can refute it. So anybody can come up with a notion of human nature, and I don't think you can really validate it or ultimately validate it or deny it through the empirical world. You can always say, well, we just haven't arrived at a society where, in fact, human beings will be able to realize their true potential. Now,
I was talking about piecing that together.
Right, but one does look at the empirical world for intuitions as to what actually is that potential. But one cannot really firmly validate it or deny it. So they interact, but it's not a very rigid relationship.
Go ahead.
Well, I think that your point, my own opinion is that you're pointing to something very true, which has been underestimated in social thinking up to now, which is that theories are not just like these battles between truth and falsehood, where the true notion is clearly delineated at some point in history, and everything else is swept away as false. Obviously, people at various different points make decisions, and those decisions never seem to come to an end necessarily, although for particular people, they might be very much persuaded or convinced off of particular notions of what human nature really reflects. I wanted to point my question toward something of substance in your paper that I think is rather interesting. You seem to be contending, I want to get this straight, a notion of what the role, I mean, in a certain sense, I think the industrial proletariat is a causal agent for you, historically. That it plays a certain determinant or a serious, important role that you want to defend in the remaking of society, in transforming social relations. You seem to be contending against the idea of its messianic role, of it somehow coming to the forefront and leading all the struggles against oppression and exploitation. You seem to be suggesting a different framework for its concrete transformative role as a causal agent within that role. It's much more rooted in the place of production, in its ability to transform the relations in production. My question is, and this is just intuition, I suspect from hearing different things that you've said that you might subscribe to a Marxist notion of human nature in this sense, that one is a fisherman in the morning, a poet in the afternoon, a politician in the evening. I forget exactly how Marx formulated it, but his sense, right, his sense was that this kind of all-sided human development of individual potentials becomes part of the industrial proletariat. I think that was very much his view of what he saw the future of the working class being. I sense that you have some affinity for that. My question is, how do you see doing that if the workers basically are engaged? Is it through the process of production that they can become fishermen, critics, artists, and poets? Or is that a fair question? Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah. Is it in the process of their struggles to transform their workplace that they actually become these all-sided human beings, creative and reaching their full potentials? Or in fact, is that an impediment to their reaching that kind of? Are you really deviating from the Marxist model?
Well, I don't know where you pick out the many-sided individual from.
Yeah, it's from the German ideology.
Yeah. No, we know where it's from in Marx. We know where it's from in Marx, but I don't know where you pick it out in Burawoy.
I'm guessing. From something you said in class.
Yeah, no. I mean, the direction in which this idea of production politics takes me is much more to an image of collective self-management, a society based on collective self-management. And as much as I'm avoiding these questions of human nature, I find them very tricky, and that's perhaps my sort of structuralist Althusserian background. That my image of the future is one of collective self-management, in which there are units in society that are self-governed, and there's also a central coordinating unit responsive to the other units. That there is, in a sense, a combination of planning and worker self-management. I mean, that is my conception of a society which is self-directing, which makes history into itself. Now, that's obviously linked to my interest in production politics and related to state politics. That's a particular take I have on it. That's what that notion of socialism that I'm led to. But I don't know how to answer your question about the human nature. I mean, I can answer a Marxist answer to you, and that is that Marx himself conceived of the working day falling and falling, and so that it left more time for people to engage in being a critic, housekeeper, mother, and an artist. And it's that what crucial factor is the reduction of the length of the working day, which will follow on the expansion of the force of production. I mean, we can go into an exegesis and discussion of Marx's work in this respect, but that's not actually the center of my own work, and I just feel a bit uncomfortable with questions of human nature, because ultimately almost anything goes. Well, I mean, don't you think we should end there?
Yeah. Can I just have one final question?
Right.
Earlier you mentioned about the breaks in consciousness which have taken place, I think, in America and generally in the world. Why, finally, in your opinion, has there not been a revolution? And why, say, in America, in the most recent election here, why don't the so-called working class vote with their feet and go and give more votes to the Democratic Party?
Well,
that's really not a question for the tape.
Well, as a Marxist sociologist, I want to know why there hasn't been a revolution.
Let it slide.
Yeah, I think it's
Okay.
Thank you.
So, well, I mean, the answer I gave in the book that I wrote was that actually consent, it's a character of the productive process that generates consent to the capitalist order, which is not an orthodox Marxist position. And but that's the answer. And you know, Marxists have spent so much of their energy figuring out why there's no revolution in this country. I can give you a long, long list of answers, but I've just given you mine, and that's at least that's definitely a beginning.